There is a moment between sleeping and waking that should belong only to silence, yet for many that silence is not empty. It is filled with a crushing weight, with a breath that does not belong to them, with shadows that seem to know their name. They open their eyes and discover that they cannot move. Their chest pinned as if by an unseen hand, their throat closed as if by invisible fingers. They are awake, but trapped inside a body that no longer answers them. They try to scream, but no sound escapes, and in that suffocating silence they realize they are not alone. Sleep paralysis is often explained away as a harmless misfiring of the body, a confusion between dreaming and waking. Yet those who have lived through it do not speak of harmlessness. They speak of a presence, a figure that waits at the foot of the bed watching. Sometimes it stands in the corner, its face hidden but its intent unmistakable. Others feel the bed dip, as if someone unseen has climbed onto it, crawling closer inch by inch. Some describe the cold pressure of hands against their chest, holding them down until the air in their lungs feels like fire. Across cultures and centuries, the visions repeat with unnerving precision. In distant lands and isolated homes, the stories mirror one another. The dark intruder, the shadow that bends over sleeping bodies, the eyes that do not blink. If it were a dream, why do the details match so perfectly? Why do people who have never met speak of the same shape, the same crushing weight, the same silent terror that steals their breath in the dead of night? The room always feels colder in those moments. The shadows lengthen in ways that should not be possible. Walls bend, ceilings stretch, and the world narrows to the sound of blood pounding in the ears. And then there is the whisper. Some hear it clearly, words carried on a voice that is neither male nor female. Others feel it more than hear it, like a vibration at the edge of their skull, repeating a command they cannot disobey. Do not move. Do not look. Do not breathe. The human mind is a fragile instrument, and yet it is often quick to rationalize. It says this is nothing more than the body in confusion. It says this is the brain inventing monsters because it cannot process its own fear. But the body remembers differently. The heart races long after the paralysis lifts. The skin crawls with the certainty of having been touched. The memory of the figure does not fade with daylight. Imagine lying in your own bed, the most familiar place in the world, and realizing it has become a trap. You can see the glow of the clock on the nightstand, the faint outline of curtains stirring in the wind, the objects in your room exactly where you left them. You know you are awake, and yet the air feels wrong. The silence feels poisoned, and the shadows shift in ways you cannot explain. You are awake but powerless, awake but already marked. There are those who insist that what is seen in paralysis is hallucination. They say the mind fabricates the intruder, the witch, the demon, yet even science falters in explaining why those hallucinations carry the weight of reality. Why does the body feel bruised as if held down with true force? Why do those who suffer from it describe the smell of sulfur, the sound of footsteps, the pressure of weight sinking the mattress beside them? Hallucinations may create visions, but can they leave imprints on the soul? Every story ends the same way. The paralysis breaks, breath returns, the body obeys again, the room is once again empty. Yet the relief never lasts, for each victim knows the figure did not vanish. It only retreated. It waits in the corner of the mind, patient and silent until the body is weak and the night is deep. It will return, as it always does, and next time, perhaps it will not remain only a shadow. One survivor described it best. The fear is not in the paralysis itself. The fear is in the certainty that something is there with you, and it wants you to know that you cannot stop it. The rain falls outside, steady and indifferent. The sound should bring comfort, a rhythm older than memory, but in the spaces between the drops the silence stretches, and with it comes the knowledge that night is never safe. In the dark, when the body betrays you and the mind is held captive, what if the shadow that leans over you is not a dream at all? What if the figure that has watched countless people across centuries is not a trick of sleep, but a presence that slips into the gap between dreams and waking, feeding on fear and waiting for the moment when you can no longer tell the difference between illusion and truth? The question lingers, heavy and unresolved. If so many people see the same thing in the same moment of terror, how can we be sure it is not real? The experience of waking while the body remains bound is not new. It has been recorded in ancient scrolls, whispered in villages, and feared in households for centuries. What one culture called a nightmare, another named a demon. What one healer blamed on restless spirits, another declared to be punishment for sins unspoken. And yet beneath the shifting names, the story never changes. The human body lies rigid in its bed. The breath grows shallow, and something unseen presses close in the silence of the night. Long before modern medicine attempted to explain sleep paralysis, it lived in folklore. In Northern Europe, there was talk of the mare, a twisted spirit said to sit upon the chests of sleepers, crushing their lungs with invisible weight. From this came the very word nightmare, not just a dream of terror, but a visitation. In Newfoundland, the same entity was called the Old Hag, an ancient crone whose presence was marked by paralysis, suffocation, and the dreadful sense of being observed. In parts of Japan, the phenomenon was known as kanashibari, the tightening grip of unseen forces binding the body, and in parts of Africa, whispers told of witches who traveled at night, holding victims captive in their own beds, riding them until dawn. The names differ, but the details remain eerily alike: paralysis, weight, presence. The sense that something malevolent is not only in the room but pressing itself directly into the body of the victim. These stories spread not through books or lectures, but through hushed warnings between families, through trembling confessions of those who had endured it. It was not studied, it was feared. In modern times, science offers explanations wrapped in the language of neurology. Physicians speak of REM atonia, the natural paralysis that prevents the body from acting out dreams. They describe moments when the brain wakes while the body remains trapped in that chemical stillness. They assure that it is harmless, a trick of timing. Yet such explanations do not account for the figures that stand at the edges of perception, identical across thousands of accounts from people who never spoke to one another. They do not explain why cultures separated by oceans describe the same old woman, crouching on the chest, the same man-shaped shadow that lurks by the door. To those who have never suffered, sleep paralysis is an odd curiosity, a quirk of the mind. But to those who wake to it, it is an intimate haunting. Consider the case of a young man living alone in a modest apartment on the outskirts of a quiet city. He had no interest in folklore, no knowledge of the old myths. His life was ordinary, his nights uneventful. Until one evening, after weeks of restless sleep, he awoke to find himself unable to move. The clock beside his bed glowed faintly, the minute hand frozen in his view. His chest burned with the effort of trying to breathe, every inhale shallow and incomplete. He strained to cry out but could not form a sound. At first he thought it a dream, until he noticed the corner of the room. The shadows there seemed thicker than they should be, deeper than the lamp's glow could justify. Within that darkness something shifted. A figure, impossibly tall, shoulders hunched forward, its face obscured, but its gaze fixed directly on him. The man felt his throat tighten, not from the paralysis but from the certainty that the figure had been there long before he opened his eyes. It did not move closer, yet its presence consumed the room. Seconds stretched into eternity before his body finally released. He sat up gasping, drenched in sweat, his hands trembling as he reached for the lamp that had already been on. The room was empty. The shadows were still. Yet the sense of having been watched did not leave him. When he spoke of it the next day, his friends laughed. They said it was a dream, stress, exhaustion. He tried to believe them. But when the same thing happened again, this time with the figure standing nearer, its shape more defined, belief slipped away. He stopped sleeping in silence, leaving the television on through the night. He began drinking coffee until dawn, delaying sleep as long as possible. The fear of seeing the shadow again became greater than the exhaustion. His story is not unique. Across continents, across decades, countless others have described the same figure. Not a dream, they insist. Not imagination, a presence that knows them, that waits for them, that feeds on the moment when the body is powerless. Science calls it coincidence. Folklore calls it visitation. Survivors call it truth. The history of sleep paralysis is therefore not only about medicine or myth. It is about humanity's most primal fear, the loss of control, the invasion of the familiar by the unknown. The bed, the room, the home, these should be safe places. When the terror comes from within those walls, safety itself unravels. The rain that strikes against the windows of such nights brings no comfort. Its rhythm becomes a reminder of time passing slowly, too slowly, while the body lies still and the intruder waits. For centuries, people prayed for dawn, whispering charms, clenching talismans, leaving offerings by the bed. They believed that only the rising of the sun could banish the figure. Yet even as light filled the rooms, even as the shadows retreated, survivors knew it was only temporary. Night always returns, and when it does, so does the silence, so does the wait. So does the figure at the edge of the bed, patient and unblinking. Humanity has given it 100 names, but in the end it is not the name that matters. What matters is that when the eyes open and the body remains still, the victim always knows. They are no longer alone. The man's nights no longer belonged to him. What once was rest became a place of dread, and what once was silence became heavy with unseen company. In the beginning, he tried to explain the episodes to himself with logic. He told himself it was exhaustion, too much work, stress bleeding into his sleep. He tried to forget the figure in the corner, tried to believe that his own eyes had deceived him. Yet the body remembers what the mind denies. Each time he lay down, he felt it, the waiting weight of something that would return when his guard was down. At first, the visits were separated by days. He would convince himself it had ended only for it to seize him again without warning. He would open his eyes in the early hours, the clock glowing faintly in the dark, and his limbs would already be stone. The air would feel thicker, the silence deeper. The same sensation would crawl across his chest as if someone pressed down with unseen hands pinning him. The breath that entered his lungs was never enough. He could feel his pulse racing, desperate to move, to scream, to fight, but his body refused. On one such night he heard footsteps. They did not come from outside nor from the apartment above. They came from within his own room. Soft, deliberate, too heavy to be imagination, he felt them in the floorboards, one after the other, growing closer to the bed. He strained against the paralysis, eyes wide, searching for the intruder. The shadows shifted, and for a moment he thought he saw a figure at the edge of his vision. A tall shape leaning forward, impossibly still, as though watching him with silent patience. Then came the whisper. Not clear, not human. More vibration than sound, but it filled his skull. He felt the words rather than heard them. Do not breathe. When the paralysis broke minutes later, he sat up choking, tears in his eyes, throat raw though he had not made a sound. His body trembled, soaked in cold sweat. He switched on every light in the apartment, searched every corner, checked every lock. Nothing was there. Yet the certainty remained. Something had stood near him. Something that knew he was powerless. Something that had spoken. The days after such nights blurred together. He found himself distracted at work, his hands shaking when he held a pen, his eyes scanning corners as though expecting a figure to step out of them. Sleep became impossible. He fought it as long as he could, drinking bitter coffee until dawn, leaving music playing through the night, even sitting upright in bed to fool himself into staying awake. But exhaustion always won, and when it did, the figure returned. The timeline of these encounters grew shorter, the gaps between them closing. Soon there were no days of reprieve. Each night was another battle against the paralysis. The symptoms escalated, the visions sharper. Once he awoke to feel the mattress dip at his side, as though someone unseen had lowered themselves onto the bed. The weight pressed close against his ribs, sinking the mattress deeper. He felt breath brush his ear, icy and deliberate, though no one was there. The paralysis kept him silent while his mind screamed. Another time, his eyes opened to see the ceiling distorted, bending inward, as though the room itself was folding toward him. The shadows crawled across the walls like living things, stretching long arms toward the bed. At the center of it all was the figure again, unmoving, faceless, standing as if it had always been there and always would be. He could not deny it now. It was no dream. It was a presence that claimed the night as its own. Each episode left scars invisible to others. Friends dismissed his accounts as stress-induced hallucinations. He stopped telling them. They laughed too easily, and their laughter deepened his isolation. He began to question his own sanity, yet his body betrayed him with fear too raw to ignore. The trembling hands, the racing heart, the sheer certainty of being touched, watched, commanded, all of it more real than any dream could ever be. The contradictions deepened. Doctors insisted that sleep paralysis was natural, a quirk of sleep cycles, the brain waking before the body. But how natural was it that he heard the same whisper again and again, a phrase no doctor could explain? How natural was it that he saw the same figure each time, standing in the same place waiting? His rational mind tried to accept medical explanations, but his nights argued otherwise. He was living in two realities, one that called it science and one that called it haunting. Neither reality gave him peace. With each passing week, his exhaustion grew heavier. His once orderly apartment became cluttered with untouched food, unwashed clothes, a mirror of his unraveling mind. He stopped inviting anyone inside. He feared they would sense the residue of what lingered there, the coldness in the air after each episode, the way the walls seemed too quiet, as if listening. He felt the boundaries of his life shifting, tilting toward something darker that no daylight could chase away. He began to keep a journal beside his bed, forcing himself to write down each encounter immediately after it happened. His handwriting trembled, words slanted and rushed. The entries told a story of escalation. The first time he saw the figure, the first time he heard the whisper, the first time he felt the mattress shift beneath its weight. Each night left another mark on the pages, another proof that the intruder was not imagined. But the journal did not bring clarity. It only documented his descent. Each new entry was darker, more fractured, his descriptions filled with words he had never used before. Shadows, suffocation, invasion, silence. He wrote not only to remember, but to prove to himself that it was real. Yet the more he proved it, the less he understood. The buildup of the mystery was no longer just in the nights he endured, but in the questions that plagued him during the day. Why him? Why the same figure? Why the same whisper? If it was a trick of the brain, why did it feel more consistent than dreams, more deliberate than imagination? He lived with the dreadful certainty that there was intent behind it, an intelligence that chose him as its victim, and so each night became a test. Would he fight sleep or surrender to it? Would the figure return, or had it always been waiting? In the heavy silence before his body betrayed him again, he realized the most terrifying part was not the paralysis itself, it was the waiting. Explanations came to him in fragments, each delivered with authority but none with conviction. Doctors spoke of chemical locks within the body, a natural paralysis meant to protect the dreamer from acting out the contents of their own mind. In most people, this paralysis ends the moment they wake, but in a fraction of cases the brain stirs before the body, creating a terrifying overlap where consciousness returns, yet the muscles remain imprisoned. This, they said, explained everything. The figure in the corner, the whispers, the weight on the chest, hallucinations, born from a mind struggling to make sense of immobility and fear. But the man's journal told a different story. He described details too consistent to dismiss, events that unfolded with deliberate progression rather than chaos. Hallucinations are fragmented, unstable, prone to shift and dissolve, yet his accounts were steady, repeated with unnerving sameness. Each entry revealed the same sequence: paralysis, weight, presence. The whispers were always brief, always commanding, always spoken in the same cold rhythm that no dream could mimic. If the brain were inventing, why would it invent with such precision? Researchers who studied sleep paralysis collected testimonies from across the world, compiling them into archives of fear. The similarities were impossible to ignore. In Canada, a woman described a shadow figure standing by her window night after night, whispering in a language she did not understand. In Italy, a farmer swore he awoke to the sight of an old crone crouched upon his chest, her gnarled fingers pressing into his ribs as she hissed his name. In Brazil, countless sufferers spoke of being visited by a dark intruder who sat on the edge of the bed staring without eyes. These people never knew one another, never shared their stories, yet their descriptions aligned as though each had witnessed the same thing. Science offered one possibility. The human brain, shaped by evolution, may default to similar images under stress. A vague shadow, a human-like form, an intruder standing close. It is a survival mechanism, they argued, a hyper-vigilant response to danger. The brain, half awake, projects the most threatening thing it can imagine into the paralysis. But this explanation only deepened the unease. If the brain invented threats, why did they always take the form of the same figure? Why did the descriptions not vary wildly as dreams do? Some anthropologists suggested that the consistency pointed to something deeper, an archetype buried in the collective human mind. A shadow man, a watcher in the night, an entity etched into memory across cultures. Whether born of shared biology or shared reality, the figure transcended geography. From the Arctic to the equator, people paralyzed in their beds described the same intruder. A coincidence, or a truth too disturbing to name? The man read through such reports, desperate for answers. Instead, they only confirmed his fear. His experiences were not isolated. Others had seen the same faceless shape, heard the same command to be still, felt the same suffocating pressure. If thousands endured it, Was it truly hallucination, or was it visitation? Psychologists weighed in with theories of trauma, suppressed, fear manifesting in the liminal space between sleep and wakefulness. They claimed the brain, flooded with anxiety, gave form to dread itself. But what trauma had he carried? His life had been ordinary, unmarked by tragedy. If trauma explained it, why did it begin suddenly, without warning, without cause? He examined his own apartment for explanations. Perhaps carbon monoxide, a gas leak, something poisoning his sleep. But the air was clear, detectors silent. He considered his diet, his routines, his medications. There were none. He changed his mattress, his pillows, even moved the bed from one wall to another. Nothing shifted the episodes. The figure remained, constant and patient. What unsettled him most were the physical traces left behind. Once, after a night of suffocation, he woke to find faint bruises along his ribs, dark marks where he had felt invisible hands pressing. Another time he woke with his sheets torn, fabric twisted tight as if by a struggle he had never been able to make. Hallucinations should not leave bruises. Shadows should not crease fabric. Yet the evidence was there, silent and damning. The deeper he looked, the more contradictions surfaced. Medical journals spoke of sleep paralysis as harmless, an illusion of the body. Yet testimonies from sufferers told of terror so profound it fractured their lives, driving some into insomnia, others into madness. Some never recovered. A handful whispered that their paralysis escalated, that one night the figure touched them not only in dream but in reality. Their stories ended abruptly, as if unfinished. The man began to fear that his journal was not only a record, but a countdown. Each entry marked a deeper intrusion, a closer presence. He noticed patterns. The figure always began at the corner, then by the door, then beside the bed. The progression was undeniable. It was moving closer. Experts argued that the brain, half awake, could misinterpret shadows as threats. But how could shadows whisper words? How could shadows press weight into lungs until breath fled? How could shadows leave the taste of metal in the mouth, the smell of sulfur in the air, lingering long after the paralysis broke? These were not dreams that dissolved in daylight. They were experiences that bled into waking life, refusing to fade. He read of experiments where researchers induced paralysis in volunteers. Electrodes tracked brainwaves, machines recorded breath and heartbeat. The subjects described shadows too, whispers, figures, yet the scientists dismissed them, chalking it up to suggestion. But what if it was more? What if in creating paralysis, they had opened a door that should not be opened? As his nights grew darker, the man clung to one chilling thought. The figures described by others were too similar to his own. If these were hallucinations, why were they identical? If these were dreams, why did they behave with the same intent? Dreams do not wait at the same corner, do not whisper the same commands, do not press the same suffocating weight into chest after chest. It was then he realized the truth that no expert could give him. What was happening to him was not bound to the walls of his apartment. It was not even bound to his own mind. It was part of something larger, something older, something that did not depend on his belief to exist. He stared at the latest entry in his journal, the words trembling across the page. It is closer now. The evidence was there. The testimonies aligned. The theories clashed and contradicted. Yet none of it mattered. The figure did not care for explanations. It cared only that he could not move, that he could not speak, that he could not stop it from drawing nearer. And every night, it returned. Fear has a way of hollowing the body from the inside. What begins as a single night of terror becomes a shadow that clings to every waking hour. For the man who kept the journal, the episodes did not remain confined to darkness. They followed him into daylight, shaping the way he moved, the way he breathed, the way he trusted his own senses. His nights may have been stolen first, but soon his days unraveled as well. Each morning he woke exhausted not from sleep but from battle. His body ached as though he had fought unseen hands. His thoughts were scattered, dulled by hours of restless fear. At work, Colleagues noticed the tremor in his hands, the deep hollows under his eyes, the way his attention slipped from conversations as though he were listening for something no one else could hear. He grew defensive when asked about it. How could he explain without sounding broken? To say he was being hunted not by people but by shadows would only bring laughter or pity. He could not stand either. He withdrew. He stopped meeting friends, stopped answering calls. Social gatherings became unbearable. In crowded rooms, he felt the air pressing down in the same way it did at night, as though paralysis could find him even there. He sat in silence while others spoke, staring at the floor, knowing they thought him distant, strange, or ill. None of them knew that he was fighting the memory of whispers in the dark, the taste of fear that still lingered on his tongue. The worst moments were not the episodes themselves, but the waiting. As evening fell, his body tightened with dread. He avoided his bed, pacing the apartment as though walking could delay the inevitable. He left lights burning, television humming, music filling the silence, but no distraction held. The hour always arrived when exhaustion demanded surrender. He climbed into bed knowing the figure would return, knowing the paralysis would lock him down. Fear drained him long before sleep did. The human mind is not built for endless vigilance. Slowly, cracks appeared. He began to see movement in the corners of rooms during the day, flickers of shadows where there should be none. At first, he blamed fatigue. But the glimpses became more frequent, more deliberate. He would turn his head in time to catch a silhouette vanishing around a doorway, or a reflection shifting in the dark glass of a window. Whether it was imagination or intrusion no longer mattered. He believed it, and belief is a wound that festers. Sleep deprivation deepened the paranoia. Hours blurred into one another. The man lost weight, meals left untouched. He walked the streets at night to avoid his apartment, yet no place gave him peace. Even in the open air, he felt the gaze of something unseen, patient and cruel. It was not only in his home now, it was everywhere. The paralysis had unlocked a fear that daylight could not contain. Families of other sufferers reported the same unraveling. A woman in her 50s confessed that she could no longer share a bed with her husband, fearing that her screams would wake him to a sight she could not explain. A young man stopped driving at night, certain that shadows followed him in the rearview mirror. Children refused to sleep alone, their parents forced to keep lamps burning until dawn. The intrusion poisoned not only the afflicted, but everyone around them. Love eroded under the weight of sleeplessness. Trust dissolved in the silence of unspoken dread. The psychological toll was not limited to fear of the episodes themselves. It bled into identity. Victims began to doubt their sanity. Were they hallucinating? Were they cursed? Were they marked by something that chose them for reasons no human could understand? Doubt is its own prison. It breaks people in ways terror alone cannot. Some tried therapy. They spoke of shadows, whispers, suffocation, only to be told it was stress, trauma, a tired brain, playing tricks. These explanations brought no comfort. To label the figure unreal did not erase its presence. If anything, it isolated them further. They felt unheard, dismissed, left alone in their terror. Others turned to faith. They clutched crosses, recited prayers, burned incense. Some swore it helped. Others swore it enraged the presence, making the nights worse. There were those who began to welcome the paralysis. The fear became so constant, so suffocating that surrender seemed easier. If the figure wanted to come, let it. If it wanted to press its hands into lungs until breath fled, let it. This hopeless acceptance was the most dangerous stage where terror eroded into resignation. It was no longer about surviving the night. It was about enduring until something inevitable happened. For the man with the journal, the emotional collapse was clear. His entries changed tone over time. In the beginning, he wrote with urgency, a need to prove, to understand. Later, his words slowed, scattered across the page. He stopped asking why it happened. He stopped asking what it was. His notes became shorter, colder. It stood closer tonight. I heard it breathe. I think it touched my hand. The final entries were not written in sentences at all, Only single words repeated again and again. Shadow, silence, wait. Psychologists could describe the condition with diagrams, could point to brainwaves and neurotransmitters, but none of their language captured the despair of living it. To be awake and powerless is to face the oldest human fear, helplessness. To be awake and watched is to face the deepest human dread, intrusion. To live through both night after night is to hollow out the mind until nothing remains but fear. The emotional impact of sleep paralysis is not simply terror in the dark. It is the dismantling of identity, the corrosion of trust, the slow suffocation of ordinary life. Those who endure it do not only lose sleep, they lose peace, they lose certainty, they lose themselves. And when the body finally breaks under the strain, when the mind no longer distinguishes between night and day, when every shadow carries the threat of breath against the skin, then the figure has already won. The man's descent into fear was not unique, and because it was not unique, investigators had long tried to understand what lay beneath the phenomenon. Sleep paralysis has drawn doctors, psychologists, anthropologists, and even paranormal researchers to the same question. What stalks the moments between waking and dreaming? Each discipline arrived armed with theories, yet none could claim certainty. Instead, their answers tangled, leaving sufferers stranded between science and superstition. The medical world stood firm on its ground. Neurologists pointed to ramatonia, a natural process in which the body paralyzes itself during dream sleep. For most, the brain and body awaken in unison, but for a vulnerable few, the brain wakes first, leaving the body trapped. Hallucinations, they said, were a byproduct of this overlap. The brain, straddling dream and wakefulness, projected images of fear into the room. These images reflected primal instincts, predators, intruders, shadows. The explanation was neat, clinical, and dismissive of deeper questions. Yet when researchers gathered testimonies, cracks appeared. Hallucinations should vary wildly, yet the reports aligned. The shadow figure, the old hag, the suffocating weight, these motifs repeated across oceans and centuries. Coincidence, said the doctors. Archetype, said the psychologists. But the sufferers asked, what if coincidence is not enough? Psychological investigations dug deeper. Some linked sleep paralysis to anxiety disorders, trauma, or disrupted sleep cycles. They argued that unresolved fear crawled into the threshold between dream and reality, given shape by the brain's desperate attempt to interpret confusion. To them, the figure was not real. It was a mirror of the victim's inner world. A soldier might see an attacker. A grieving widow might see a departed spouse. A fearful child might see a monster. Yet this theory faltered in the face of consistency. Why did so many see the same faceless shadow? The same crouching crone? Trauma is personal. Shadows are universal. Anthropologists added another layer. They traced cultural folklore, from the mare in Europe to the kanashibari in Japan to the old hag in Newfoundland. They noted how belief shaped experience. In cultures where demons were blamed, sufferers saw demons. Where witches were feared, witches appeared. In modern cities, the figure became a faceless intruder. Culture, they said, gave shape to fear. But this theory too stumbled. Some sufferers claimed to have known nothing of these myths before their encounters. They described the figure in detail, only to later discover that generations before them had reported the same. How could culture explain knowledge that preceded exposure? Paranormal investigators saw opportunity where scientists saw failure. To them, sleep paralysis was not illusion but visitation. They claimed that in those fragile moments when the body was bound and the mind awake, a door opened between worlds. The shadows, they argued, were not creations of the mind but entities that slipped through. Their goal remained debated. Some believed they fed on fear itself, harvesting terror as nourishment. Others whispered darker theories, that the figures were not visitors, but wardens keeping humanity docile in sleep, preventing us from seeing truths we were never meant to see. The man read of experiments held in secret, where subjects were kept under surveillance during paralysis. Cameras captured their stillness, their silent terror. Yet in some accounts, the footage showed flickers of movement in the shadows of the room. Shapes that did not match the subjects, distortions that appeared only during episodes. Official reports dismissed these as artifacts of light. Paranormal circles claimed otherwise. Then came the conspiracies. Online forums whispered that governments had long known of the shadow figures, that research into sleep paralysis was buried under classified projects. Some claimed the entities were not supernatural at all, but remnants of contact. beings not from dream but from elsewhere, using sleep as a veil to enter unnoticed. These theories were dismissed as fantasy. Yet for the man who felt breath against his skin, who saw the figure inch closer night after night, such possibilities no longer seemed impossible. Investigations left him stranded. Science insisted he was safe, though every fiber of his being told him otherwise. Psychology insisted the figure was his own creation, though it behaved with intent beyond his imagination. Folklore insisted he was part of something ancient, though that knowledge offered no protection. Paranormal claims insisted he was not alone, though that only deepened his terror. No theory comforted him. Each only confirmed that the truth remained hidden. He turned to his journal again, writing not to explain but to track. He noticed that the figure grew bolder with each episode. At first it had lingered by the corner. Then it stood by the bed. Now some nights it leaned so close he could feel the cold against his cheek. He wrote of whispers that grew louder. Not words but vibrations that resonated in his bones. If this were hallucination, why did it behave with progression? Hallucinations fade. This did not. Other sufferers reported similar escalation. A woman in her 60s claimed that after years of paralysis, the figure finally touched her arm. She swore the bruises lingered for weeks. A man in Mexico confessed that during one episode, he felt himself pulled from the bed, dragged toward the ceiling only to awaken on the floor, tangled in sheets. No doctor could explain how a paralyzed body could move itself. Theories tried to fit these accounts into tidy boxes. None fit. Investigations reached walls that no evidence could scale. In the end, every answer collapsed into the same silence, the same lack of proof. But the absence of proof did not erase the fear. If anything, it sharpened it. The man closed his journal one night after writing the words, "It is not imagined. It is not mine alone. It chooses." He stared into the dim corners of his apartment, waiting for the next paralysis, wondering if the theories mattered at all. Perhaps the figure cared nothing for science, psychology, or folklore. Perhaps its only purpose was to remind him, and anyone who suffered, that when the body is powerless, the mind alone cannot save them. Theories multiplied. Investigations deepened, yet the presence remained unchanged. It waited, it whispered, it pressed down in silence, and no human explanation could strip away its gaze. In the end, the man's story did not end with understanding. It ended in silence, not the silence of peace, but the kind that holds its breath, the kind that waits for something to happen. He stopped writing in his journal one night. The entries ended mid-sentence, as though the pen had slipped from his hand. The book remained open on the bedside table, the last words scrawled across the page. It stood beside me this time. It touched my hand. No one knew what happened afterward. Neighbors claimed they heard nothing unusual. No cries, no struggle. When questioned, they mentioned only the faint sound of furniture creaking in the small hours, as if someone were moving through the apartment slowly, carefully, without light. The next morning, his blinds remained drawn. Days passed before anyone knocked on his door. By then, the man was gone. No sign of departure, no sign of violence. The apartment was empty except for the journal, the bed, and the lingering cold that visitors swore did not feel natural. His disappearance was added to the margins of other cases, unspoken but not forgotten. Researchers dismissed it as unrelated. People vanish for many reasons, they said, but those who had read his journal, those who had endured their own nights of paralysis, recognized the pattern. When the figure grows close enough to touch, when the whispers fill more than the silence, something changes. The paralysis is no longer a boundary. It becomes an invitation. What is sleep paralysis, then? A trick of the brain, or a door to something older, something darker? Science insists it is harmless, yet people disappear. Psychology insists it is trauma, yet the bruises remain. Folklore insists it is visitation, and perhaps that explanation lingers because it feels truer than all the rest. It does not matter what name is given to it. The experience itself defies names. The haunting lies not only in the paralysis, but in the questions left behind. If so many across the world, across centuries, see the same figure, how can coincidence explain it? If thousands of voices describe the same shadow, the same breath, the same command, does the pattern itself become proof? At what point does shared nightmare become shared reality? For those who suffer, the questions are not academic. They are immediate. They lie down each night knowing the body may betray them, knowing the eyes may open to darkness filled with presence. They whisper to themselves that it will not happen again, but they know it will. Night is patient. The figure is patient. And patience is its weapon. Even those who recover, who move beyond the paralysis, do not escape unscarred. They carry the memory of breath stolen from lungs, of weight pressing down, of eyes watching in silence. They wake in safe rooms, surrounded by daylight, yet still glance at corners as though shadows might shift. They live with the knowledge that the line between dream and waking is thinner than anyone dares to admit. And they know that once you have seen the figure, it does not forget you. The man's absence remains unexplained. His journal is all that is left. Pages filled with proof that cannot be used. Testimony that cannot be tested. For those who read it, the words are enough. They are reminders that the phenomenon is not merely a curiosity, not merely science, not merely myth. It is something that breathes just beyond reach. Something that chooses when to press close, when to whisper, when to touch. The rain falls outside as it always has, indifferent to fear, to loss, to silence. Yet those who lie awake at night listening to its rhythm know the spaces between the drops carry something else. A presence. A patience. A warning. What if the figure you see in paralysis is not yours alone? What if it is the same figure that has stood in rooms for centuries, watching, waiting, marking those it touches? And what if one night, when the paralysis ends and you sit up gasping in the dark, you realize that the corner of the room is not empty at all? The question remains, unanswered and unanswerable. When your body freezes in the night, when breath grows shallow and eyes open to silence, how can you be sure the shadow watching you is only in your mind?